we did promise a bit of a discussion on the Reconstructionist movement, and I'm happy to do it. I think just because it's a topic that's a little bit more, let's say, closer to our hearts, and I think something there's a lot more controversy about is that maybe we can discuss a little bit about this open orthodox movement in a little bit. I think that it probably has made more scandals pretty much across the board than most of the other movements, Reconstructionist. I mean, just like we say about reform, it's not like these movements are proselytizing. They're not creating people who believe and think like them. The one thing that all these movements have going for them, if you will, is that the cost of entry is very, very low. You don't really have to do anything. You don't have to change anything. You don't have to kasher any of your pots or pans. You don't have to restrict your diet. You can do whatever you want. You can even marry non-Jews, as long as you are a nice person, you give money to the Beit Knesset, whatever it is. So that's the going model. The more liberal you can be, the more inclusive you can be. And Europe can write you a book about that liberalism and inclusion are fantastic things, until you absolutely lose your identity and you get run over by people who don't care, who would like to be included but don't care to be part of what it is that you're trying to include them in. Manuel is a little bit more diplomatic. He doesn't have to comment. So
then we have a big... Europe has big...
You're saying Europe has some identity issues? I think so too. At any rate, the Reconstructionist movement was probably the movement that set off the most waves across pretty much all over the Jewish spectrum.
Yeah, but are they really numerous right now?
They're not very numerous. The point that I'd like to make, and the connection that I think deserves to be made, is that Reconstructionism is basically the most honest reform, in terms of what the reform has been trying to do. Reconstructionism actually did it. They don't care. They don't make any apologies. They look at everything as suggestions. Reconstructionism doesn't believe in divine inspiration. They don't even necessarily require to believe in prophecy. They just believe that people wrote rules that made sense to them at the time. They promote, and this is very interesting that I'll have to make this reference, but what Rav Meir Kahana, who fought very strongly against this in America before he formed the Jewish Defense League, before he was famous for his entrance into Israeli politics, Rav Meir Kahana was very actively writing against the reform movement in America. So people today would paint a picture of him and tell you, he was an extremist, he was this, he was that. First of all, Jews were killed in Brooklyn during the race riots. A lot of the Jews who supported the civil rights movement, unfortunately, there were attacks. The Nation of Islam formed at around the same time. This is the 1960s. The Nation of Islam, because it's Islam, was naturally anti-Semitic by its very definition. So Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, Louis Farrakhan, Mahmoud is still alive, unfortunately. All these, and I love that name because Farrakh in Arab is a child that was born to unmarried parents, like not a mamzer, but so he's somewhere between a mamzer and a Farrakh. Anyway, Rav Kahana wrote a number of very interesting essays on the topic. They're still available. You can find them on the internet. I'm sure the FBI would flag your IP address just for.
It's okay with all the links you post on my Facebook page. I'm flagged forever.
Yeah, Dire Straits is really going to put you over the edge.
No, this one is fine.
I'm sure Steve Miller Band and Dire Straits have tagged you and labeled you as an extremist, and there's no chance
that was the last straw.
Rehabilitate your good reputation. So what Rav Kahana wrote about, which was true then, I'm talking about the 1960s for the most part, late 50s, early 60s, and then the early 70s, but at that time he was already getting involved in Israeli politics. He made Aliyah right after the Yom Kippur War, as did a lot of notable people, by the way, after Yom Kippur of Ashkenazi. Made his Aliyah after the Yom Kippur War. He came to France in 1962.
62, like all the Algerians.
Yeah, during the Civil War broke out.
Yeah.
And I believe he arrived in Israel right after the Yom Kippur, right before the Yom Kippur War. So the early 70s were a very interesting time. By the way, just again to put things in historical perspective, we can talk about the reform, we can talk about Rav Kahana. That tens of thousands of American Jews came with him. It wasn't like the man didn't have a following. It wasn't like he was considered, in his religious opinions, anything short of basically Haredi or like Haredi Tzioni, somewhere between Kippah Saruga and the Haredi movement. He learned in Lakewood, right? Lakewood Yeshiva, like Beit Midrash Gavoa of Lakewood. He was a very knowledgeable and erudite man. He was an attorney by training, he had a degree in law. And he was a very eloquent speaker and writer, so certainly he had his opinions. They were all from the Talmud. It wasn't like he was making things up. Whether or not the Talmud is applied this way today is, I guess, the point of debate. If anyone cared to debate him on substance, that would have been it. But the Haredi community never said that, his sources are illegitimate. They would just tell you they still felt that we're in a sort of galut. Even if in Israel we technically have a government, they felt that, we were still living in a state of galut and that we shouldn't make too many waves. And his point was, it's not making waves to say the Arabs shouldn't be killing Jews. Like, I don't see what's so revolutionary about that. To the Haredi mentality, that's revolutionary. To the rest of the world, it's unfortunately all in a day's work. No one cares when Jews get killed. So, anyway, what Rav Kahana wrote, there's a couple of essays that you can look up. I can find them for you. Post them on my wall. I don't care.
I'm happy to have them.
Yeah. we'll look them up on my wall. One of them was it was like a 10 or 11 page essay called "What Makes Bernie Run." Okay, whence the title "What Makes Bernie Run." Bernie was a reference to a sitcom called Bernie and the Shiksa. It was actually, I don't remember if it was NBC or ABC, one of these network, national syndicated networks, decided it would be really funny. This is in the late 60s, I believe. It would be really funny if they were to take something that was becoming so accepted. It was almost cliche. It was like, sure, everyone knows that Jewish guys marry non-Jewish girls. And it was so funny and so common, they figured, you know what? Jews make really good comedians anyway. Why don't we just use that angle and actually make what they would call an ethnic comedy, right? Here's another hot button topic. Bill Cosby, right? Again, but this guy was basically one of the first ethnic comedians in American comedy. In the late 60s, early 70s, Bill Cosby was the clean-cut, no profanity, funny delivery, funny presentation. So obviously he was up to some not very funny things. And, he deserves to be prosecuted and probably executed for what he did. But at the time, in the late 60s, the early 70s, ethnic music was coming into onto the scene. The Beatles, a lot of other bands were borrowing Indian sounds and some, Far Eastern sounds. Adam, you're familiar with some of this stuff. The sitar and some of the Led Zeppelin borrowed some of this stuff. Anyway, it was becoming cool to have an ethnicity outside of being just American. In Europe, that never really happened, but in America, where they're still receiving a lot of friends to a degree. They're colonialists, so the cultures that they had previously conquered,
now, it's fancy to help to be nice with the Arabs and
so here in America, where basically everybody has some kind of ethnicity, and especially after the war, when a lot of different cultures started to move here, in the beginning, people expected you to assimilate. It was basically you came to America, and if your name was offensive to American ears, you changed it. A lot of examples of that. La Bamba, Adam, what was the Ricky Valens?
Yeah.
Richie Valens was actually, I think, either Valentino or Valencia.
That was Valentine.
No. He was Spanish. I mean, the song was in Spanish.
Okay.
So he changed his name to Valens, so people shouldn't be offended by the fact that he has a Mexican-sounding last name. It was like an insult to American culture, even though he sang a song called La Bamba, para bailar La Bamba. Like all the words are in Spanish. In order to dance La Bamba, you have to. So the first ethnic musicians to actually use their ethnic names, meaning they didn't change them to an Anglo-Saxon American name, and this is one of the things that made them famous, were Simon and Garfunkel, two Jewish guys. Last name, if your last name is a first name, you know the guy's Jewish. Either he's Temani or he's German. Those are like the two cultures that have, last names for first names. Just simple patronymics.
Or Libya.
A lot of, right. Reuven, right.
Dylan's a good example of
someone who changed his name, correct. And it's funny that, he claimed to be the more folk song oriented, sounds almost like authentically traditionally American. Yeah. Robert Zimmerman, okay, do what you will with it. And here comes Simon and Garfunkel, who don't claim to be especially, maybe they were folky, but maybe a little bit more creative as well. But that was a big thing. Why would anybody buy a record that's anybody American, Anglo-Saxon and Protestant, buy a record that has a guy named Garfunkel on it? It doesn't make any sense to them. But they were a very big hit, and they were the ones who actually blazed that trail. What am I getting at? I'm getting at the point that it became cool to have some kind of ethnicity. And instead of hiding your ethnicity and expecting people to change your name, in the late 60s and early 70s, it became okay to have an Irish or an Italian or a Spanish last name. You didn't necessarily have to change it. Another example of this was, Charlie Sheen and Emilio Estevez, the brothers. Martin Sheen was a famous actor. Not that Charlie Sheen is a good example of anything, but he didn't want his father's name, but he couldn't have gone into acting with last name like Estevez, until this became popular in the late 60s, early 70s. So, Rav Kahana was horrified by this new sitcom called Bernie and the Shiksa. Wouldn't it be funny, since you have millions of Jews marrying non-Jewish women, wouldn't it be funny if, and I guess it was the same way, vice versa, wouldn't it be funny if we actually had a sitcom that focuses on the funny differences and similarities and the joys and challenges of intermarriage, where chances are, if she's Irish or Italian or Protestant, her parents probably are anti-Semitic, and he's Jewish, chances are his parents don't approve of the marriage either, and it was a show that the networks thought had a lot of potential to it, and it was canceled after, I think, 2 or 3 airings, like 2 or 3 episodes. And the reason it was canceled is because the reform movement was indignant. How can you do such a thing? How can you officially give your seal of approval to assimilation, something we take so seriously? We're barely 20, 30 years after the war, and all of a sudden, you're promoting this stereotype that it's perfectly okay for a Jewish guy to marry a non-Jewish girl. Rabbi Kahana says, wait a second. This is the reform movement. This is the progressive, liberal, leftist, open-minded, do whatever makes you feel good movement. And all of a sudden, you're offended or insulted by this concept of assimilation that you yourselves are manufacturing en masse. You are the movement that encourages people to do this. And he went even further and he said, this is why I like this particular article. Again, your political opinions aside, I never really cared what you guys thought politically, but you can appreciate, at least in the context of the generation, of what was going on. Basically what he was writing, and he was saying, if I don't want my children to marry an Irish American or an Italian American or a Chinese American, it's because I believe that we as a people have an obligation, a responsibility, a tradition to uphold. I have nothing against my children marrying someone who converted to Judaism. I couldn't care less if my daughter marries a guy who's ethnically Nigerian or Algerian or Japanese or South American, as long as he observes the Torah and the mitzvot. You're opposed to it because you're all racist. The only grounds on which you can actually oppose such a thing is because you're actually inherently racist. There's something latently racist about not wanting your son or daughter to marry someone from another ethnicity. So he's saying, I'm not offended by the show. The show is basically pointing out that you as a movement have desecrated everything special about the Torah and about Jewish tradition. And the only thing, like the last straw, the only thing that still really bothers you about your interactions with the non-Jews is assimilation. It's like, eat whatever you want, drink whatever you want, work on Shabbat, eat chelev, drink dam, drink blood, whatever makes you feel good. When it comes to marriage, do me a favor, marry another girl who does the exact same thing. She drives on Yom Kippur, she smokes on Shabbat. As long as she's Jewish, I don't care. If she's not Jewish, I'm opposed to it. Why? On religious grounds, on spiritual grounds? Is it something about your tradition that disturbs you? Clearly you don't adhere to your tradition, so what is it that you're promoting? You're promoting racism. You're promoting the hatred or the fear of other groups only because of who they are. Because you don't like Italians, and you don't, no offense, Emanuele, you don't like Irishmen, you don't like Asiatic types, you like South Americans, etc. Or Europeans for that matter. So, the Reform movement has always kind of curiously hung on to certain taboos. The Reconstructionist movement is the movement that did away with the word taboo. There is nothing taboo to the Reconstructionist movement. I don't know why, but when I was still getting Google ads, I guess I still do, I don't know, on the side of my, there's like a sidebar in your Gmail. Mm-hmm. So every time, I don't know what, I guess it was the signature of my emails, like Rabbi Avidan Elkin. And the number one ad that came up was this rabbi that specializes in multicultural or multi-ethnic or interreligious interfaith marriages, they call it. So this woman who specializes in these things, apparently she must make a lot of money, she had like a Google ad running for her that, anybody who officiates marriage or would like such a marriage officiated should go to her. Where no one else would officiate such a marriage, and up until relatively recently, even the Reform weren't crazy about it, Reconstructionists came out and said, hey, the rules of the game have very simply changed. So we hear you, Rabbi Kahana, we're not racist. We openly condone and encourage people to explore and look into whatever it is that they want. This isn't the conservative movement that claims they have a Talmudic source for everything that they do. They'll tell you there are some interesting illusions. In other words, they'll tell you that when Yehuda married the daughter of Shua, right, Bat Shua, the one that who gave birth to Er, Onan, and Shelah, doesn't say explicitly anywhere in Torah Shebichtav that she converted. Look it up, Abigail. If you find the pasuk, I'll buy you ice cream. But it doesn't appear anywhere in Torah Shebichtav. So we have Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh tells us, of course, naturally, for one of the children of Yaakov who takes the Torah so seriously, the one must have converted. We don't. I mean, you find it's alluded to a little bit more openly in the case of Ruth Moaviyah. It's not. She makes statements to this effect. It was in front of Naomi. It wasn't in front of an entire Beit Din. So we have, by way of our tradition, of course, Ruth Moaviyah did convert at the end. She is the great grandmother of David HaMelech. They'll tell you not necessarily. Torah Sheba'al Peh is optional according to these people. It's just the rabbis putting a nice spin, a nice explanation on things. But it's in no way binding in terms of interpretation of these traditional texts. And if you look at them in some kind of historical context, you effectively come to the conclusion that everybody married whoever they wanted, and this is what we should do too. And why pass up the opportunity for love? Because there's a pasuk somewhere in Shir HaShirim that says love is really great. And look at Mishlei, and if you found your soulmate, this is a great thing. It's a gift from God, etc. Doesn't matter. She's Jewish. She's not Jewish. It's all okay. In the end, what counts is that you go to college, that you get a degree, that you're assimilated into the culture around you. So. The only difference between Reconstructionism and Reform was that Reconstructionism effectively is a little bit more honest. And they'll tell you, we don't hold from any of these traditional mores, any of these traditional values. We don't believe there's anything wrong with it. In Reform circles, people still make faces. My granddaughter married a non-Jewish guy. In Reconstructionist circles, Mazal Tov. What's the big deal? They'll officiate gay weddings, they'll do, I saw that article that you posted, Manuel. But
that was like...
Amazing how discrimination even reaches the gay lesbian movement in Israel. The Goyim can't get enough. So the Reconstructionist movement effectively did away with all of the taboos. They are what Rav Kahana used to refer to as ethnic Jews. That's it. I can be an Irish American, I can be an Italian American, I can be an African American, I can be an Asian American, and I can be a Jewish American. Where Jewish is effectively the adjective, right? It's the descriptor, and American would be the actual noun. In other words, the name of the thing. This is I am an American first, and Jewish by persuasion, Jewish by religion, Jewish, incidentally or coincidentally, not as if to say this is a significant part of who I am. This is what influences or affects the decisions that I make, and so I have no religious inhibitions. There's no reason to fast on Yom Kippur. They did it back then for whatever historical reasons. Today it's perfectly fine if you don't want to. I don't think Reform does it anymore either. But the reality is these two movements have an awful lot in common, just that Reconstructionism effectively began as a movement that has no taboos, that has no requirements, that has no insistence on anything. You don't need to be Jewish to marry someone Jewish. Jewish is how you feel, it's how you identify. That's been a big word recently, right? How you identify. So I can be born to two very Aryan parents but identify as black, and I can steal scholarship money that was destined for real African Americans. I can be white as sour cream or confectioner's sugar, and I'm somehow entitled to call myself Indian American, Native American. As Elizabeth Warren got some kind of scholarship for being the Native American that she isn't. Maybe 1/16 somehow. So you identify. So you identify as Jewish. If you feel Jewish, you are Jewish. That's the long and short of the movement. It's also important to note that the Reform movement, I mentioned this a little bit last week, really was very strongly opposed to the concept of the founding of a state of Israel. It's worth mentioning, just like the Vatican, who felt this was antithetical to their prophecies and to their theology, their canonized texts, this was just a mistake. Israel's an anachronism. It doesn't belong there, not at this point, not at this time. It's already blasé. We've been there, done that, and we should move on because he's the one who's going to redeem. It was a big slap in the face to the Vatican, to the entire Catholic movement. The Protestants are on the fence about this one. Some of them are actively anti-Semitic, not so much here in America, you find more in England. Some of the Protestants are actually kind of supportive of Israel. The evangelical types, right? A lot of them believe that Israel either needs to be destroyed or incorporated into Christendom in order for the second coming or the next coming to occur. And some of them actually believe that no, maybe this is just God's covenant with the Jews. That's fine. It's a small country. It's not a big group of people. They've been quite influential over their history, so they're not especially bothered by it. I saw recently somebody posted, a colleague of mine posted on Facebook that one of his congregants responded to and said that she's more afraid of Ted Cruz and his evangelical, plans and the second coming than she is of Obama's, actual in practice anti-Israel policies. I thought that was interesting. At the end of the day, there are some people have this suspicion. So even a guy who actively persecutes Israel, politically speaking, is not as bad as the guy who might one day, if he believes Jesus is coming back, step on Israel's throat. So that's Reconstructionism in a nutshell. Whether or not you feel connected to Israel, whether or not you believe in Israel, they were the radical left of the Reform movement at the time. They officially broke, I believe it wasn't before the early 90s. There was actually an official schism, if you will, machloket amongst the Reform movement, where Reconstructionism effectively distilled it down to believing in practically nothing. They don't believe there's anything special about the Jewish nation. We're a nation like all others. They actively encourage you to learn from other nations' histories and other nations' ethnic identities, to appreciate the diversity of the world, etc.
So towards Israel, they are like the Reformers say,
Well,
in their relation to the state of Israel.
see, it's very interesting. And I say they're more interesting to me politically than they are religiously. Religiously, I mean, the cards are on the table. These people don't churn out Talmidei Chachamim. They don't produce very big tzaddikim. And in fact, they tolerate lots of behavior that we, according to Halacha, would consider immoral. Their stance on Israel, though, is very telling.
Who is this?
The Reform and the Reconstructionist
Still
movements.
talking about. Okay.
The Reform was initially opposed, and pretty forcefully so. With time, as, like I told you, in the 60s and 70s, ethnic identity became popular in America. It became okay to announce and define yourself as belonging to a particular ethnic group. A lot of them felt less bad about being Jewish. By this time, a lot of Jews had become very famous in America. So you had people already in the 20s and 30s who were well known, especially comedians. I mean, Groucho Marx, the Marx brothers were both Jewish. Benny Hill. America has a long history of Jewish American actors and comedians. So in the 60s and 70s, people already had what to refer to and say, oh, you're Jewish just like him or just like her. Of course, why not? Emma Lazarus was a Forodia, actually. She was Portuguese. She wrote the inscription on the base of the Statue of Liberty. I mean, there were some pretty prominent Jews. So it wasn't that big a deal. Then, their identification in the 60s and 70s with Israel, especially after the Six-Day War, nobody wanted to hear any anti-Semitism. And nobody wanted to hear any anti-Israel sentiment. You're either with us or against us. This standing on the fence is not helping anyone. So they did an about-face. They started actually to think a little bit more in terms of, sure, these are my brothers and sisters, I have some kind of an ethnic identity to uphold, even if I don't hold from anything religious. The reality is most Israelis don't either. So I can identify with these people over our bond to the land, to our common history. That's very common, even in Chiloni culture in Israel, which, by the way, cannot be defined as Reform or Reconstructionist. Really, the Israeli Chilonim are a separate category. But their point was, just like an Italian or an Italian American can go visit Italy at some point and say, sure, I feel a connection to these people, even though I live in America right now, why should a Reform Jew not be able to do the same? Because this was a very thin veneer of a connection to the land and to the people. These are also the first groups who ran to embrace the Palestinian uprisings, the Palestinian movement, of course, just like we have a connection to land, other people do. It fits with their theology. If the Reconstructionist movement was telling you, go and explore other nations, other tribes, other nation states, see their history, see the commonalities and the contrasts, etc. These movements were the first ones to promote these concepts. And they believe they're doing this out of, somewhere between a mixture of ethnic and religious motivations. They believe it's chesed, of course, you have to be kind to all nations of the world, a beacon of light to all nations of the world, as if you don't have to take your nation first and a little bit more seriously. But no, as far as they're concerned, this is our being generous and our being, hospitable and considerate, to work with terrorists and help them build a state. So this was out of their identification with, the Israeli concept, let's say, with the Israeli state. It became very clear that, politically speaking, they had more to gain by promoting this, because most liberal and totally unaffiliated Jews felt this way anyway. So if you want to keep them in a Reform or Reconstructionist synagogue, which effectively is just a Jewish social club, it becomes much easier to do so when you share their political beliefs. In fact, when you can pontificate, when you can get up and you can say, of course, we all believe there should be peace in Israel. We all believe that they should dismantle the settlements, and we all believe that we should negotiate with terrorists, etc. That becomes very politically expedient for you when that's the crowd that you're dealing with. Unfortunately, leaders of the movement are very quick to respond to things like this. So their quickness to change is something that I can't say I totally envy. I just wish a little bit of change sometimes in some of the more right-facing movements would also not necessarily do much damage. But that's where they stand today. These movements are the only movements that consider themselves even quasi-religious or somewhat religiously affiliated, and that believe it's our religious responsibility. Here they become religious. So of course you have religious responsibility to treat the Arabs this way or that way, or to deal or negotiate with terrorists as they see fit.
So historically speaking, how exactly when the Reconstructionist movement was created and
the Reconstructionist movement was effectively in the mid-'80s. There were big discussions within the Reform movement. You have to say the Reform movement covers an awful lot of people, so it's not like the movement itself is very uniform in their beliefs. You find a lot more uniformity in orthodoxy, and you also find that people fight a lot more about the I wouldn't say trivialities, but about the nuances. Because these movements are very fluid and constantly changing, again, remember, Reform isn't something that stops. There's no stasis in Reform. So you had the famous Pittsburgh Platform. This was in, I believe, 1884. Already since then, it's almost 100 years later. And by the way, even then, the Reform movement wasn't very quick to publish a list of credos or beliefs or, fundamental principles of the movement. Conservatism peeled away from them somewhat gradually since the beginning of the 20th century. And Reconstructionism basically was pulling the other way, because conservative was drawing people, if you want the technical, let's say the trajectory of the movement, conservatism was drawing everyone who was more conservatively inclined, conservative with lowercase c. They were drawing away the people that still felt some kind of a connection to ritual, to tradition, to actively practicing certain mitzvot. So if you fasted only on Yom Kippur, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you were probably Reform. Today, if you fast on Yom Kippur, you're at least conservative or up. I don't know anyone in the Reform movement who fasts on Yom Kippur anymore, not personally. And I know a lot of people, maybe they attend Reform synagogues or Reform congregations. That's what conservative pulled away from them. What happens when you have a division like that in a very large and kind of amorphous movement, what you end up with is everything that was basically center and left of it. And all of a sudden the left becomes more prominent in number, their voices are heard more loudly. So as long as conservatism was a part of Reform, meaning before they actually broke away, they were balancing each other. And there were still a significant proportion of people in the Reform movement who didn't eat pork. Maybe they ate lobster because they didn't know or they didn't care that it was asur, or they didn't, but pork, like they know, everybody knows pork is asur. When the conservatives officially broke with them, and when the fight started to get technical and specific and more bitter, because don't forget, the conservatives weren't fighting with orthodoxy. They were fighting effectively with the front. The battle was with Reform. So Reconstructionism maybe had its roots in the 70s, around the mid-80s, that they actually started to identify as such. In the beginning, they were just Reform rabbis who don't believe in any of this, and who didn't feel any more of a need, politically speaking, to appease anyone on the right. Like, we're done. Orthodoxy is where they are. The conservative movement is basically, a bunch of monkeys with ties on. Like, they're also primitive. They also believe in these routines and rituals. We don't. So we're going all the way out, and we're going to say, no, we actually officially believe that none of the biblical narrative is necessarily true or necessarily happening. First of all, not divinely inspired. They don't believe in that at all. As far as the Reconstructionist movement is concerned, God is pretty much optional.
How is it a religion?
So
at all, like
So what
it's a
What-
religiously
what-
defined group. Well, these are, if you want to know the technical questions. Look, politically speaking, halachically speaking, where does the rubber meet the road? When it comes to how you define someone who's Jewish.
Right.
This is why right now in the Israeli courts, are you following the news that just this past 2 weeks, Lee Fogel posted something on my, on
Yeah,
my
it
wall
was
about
a
this?
super interesting article.
It was an excellent, it wasn't the first article, it was a
Yeah.
follow-up.
I
2-3
did
weeks
see the
ago,
first
the Israeli Supreme Court, and in this case, and believe me, again, we've said it before, even a broken clock is accurate twice a day. The Israeli Supreme Court, which is traditionally wrong on everything, happened to get this one right.
But they're liberal.
Huh?
Liberal.
Liberal neshama is not the word. These people, Reconstructionist would be nice. I think the Arab is the only normal guy on the court. It's a crazy setup here. Plus, the court itself perpetuates itself, even from a purely procedural standpoint. The court perpetuates itself. There are 3 current justices who vote on who's going to be the next one, and they have a whole panel of people who have nothing to do with anything. There's no democracy in the process. That's what's clear. But that's how fascist, communist countries keep the power for themselves. And unfortunately, that's how Israel was founded, as a communist country. So, the Orthodox, let's say the Rabbanut in general, they're not purely Orthodox. They're probably at this point almost completely Haredi. They never relinquish control over marriages and divorces and conversions, which basically means, and this is the reason that they fight so hard to retain control over this. But this is what they call yichus. Yichus. Who can get married? Who do you allow to get married? Whose marriages do you officially recognize? That means that you care that a kohen shouldn't marry a mamzeret or a gioret or a grusha. No divorcees. A kohen can't marry a convert, and he can't marry someone who has questionable yichus. So if you don't care, and according to Reform and conservative should care, Reform and Reconstructionist will tell you this whole concept is antiquated and none of this matters anymore. And you can look in the Indian culture where they had untouchables, but today they can do whatever they want, and so too the Jews should have been in their culture. So the Rabbanut refuses to give up control over this. Every time it gets challenged, though, the Supreme Court came closer and closer to getting involved. And now what they're saying is, listen, why are these lists being kept secret? If you accept the conversions of certain rabbis and you don't accept the conversions of others, and you effectively believe that, officially Orthodox rabbis ought to have their conversions accepted, and non-Orthodox ones or 2 left-leaning ones shouldn't have their let's say their divorces or their conversions accepted, why don't you just publish the list, right? I can tell you that my ketubot are accepted in Israel. No one ever told me officially why or why they wouldn't be. I didn't expect them to be. The first time I actually officiated a wedding for a couple, I said, okay, I'm an Orthodox guy. I followed the rules. They can read the ketubah if they have any questions about it. And so when this couple told me their marriage was approved, I said, okay, I guess I'm on a list somewhere. No one ever asked me. I didn't get a membership card. No one sends me any of these. They didn't charge me membership dues, so at least that. But, so why doesn't the Rabbanut actually officially publish a list of people whose weddings are accepted and whose aren't? And whose divorces are accepted and whose aren't? And whose conversions are accepted and whose aren't? And of course, doing this is going to cause a big explosion, because as long as the list is black, as long as the list is under the table, there's no scrutiny, there's no oversight. So if a left-leaning Orthodox or right-leaning conservative rabbi gets up and says, wait a second, but I follow halacha to the letter, why are my religious documents or religious rituals not accepted? You're basically asking for a fight. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court is doing. And in this case, I have to tell you, rightfully so. There has to be some kind of above-board standard where everybody knows where they stand, and if you don't accept conservative and reform, you really have to say it. And that's always been the case. And the conservative movement is saying, well, how come our conversions aren't being accepted if we follow the Talmud? And they'll tell you, okay, because we also have a Gemara. And if you don't follow, the stringent opinions that we have customarily adopted, you're basically holding to a different standard. So conservative gittin are not accepted in Israel. Conservative weddings aren't approved necessarily. A couple comes and they're conservative and they're married, the Rabbanut will let it slide. If a couple had a conservative divorce, they're going to make them get divorced again. She's married and she has kids, they're going to look at the get, it becomes a whole complicated thing.
Wait, what is
The point that I'm making is,
I mean, don't they recognize gay marriages in Israel?
in Israel,
They recognize...
the Rabbanut,
Well, who? So there's a separate recognition by the country?
there is, the 2 biggest marriage recognizing authorities in Israel are the Rabbanut and their equivalent of the IRS.
Oh.
Who cares if you're married? Well, you're
Right.
married if you can file a joint tax return. Everybody cares about money. Or you're married if the religious authorities accept you as married. There's also an issue of the right of return, and recognizing the children. So who gets Israeli citizenship? Well, Israeli citizenship you can give them. Who gets recognized as Jewish and marriageable to someone who's also Jewish is in the exclusive hands of the Rabbanut.
Okay.
They never give up control of it and never will. And the Supreme Court might force certain things to be accepted by the system. They can force certain complications, but They pushed the Russians, the Ethiopians through. I mean, the Ethiopians, maybe there was more of a halachic basis for. The Russians, a lot of them will tell you they're not Jewish. So how do you deal with that?
Right.
And then what happens a few generations forward? It becomes a little bit of a mess. Anyway, in the trajectory of the thing, Reform and Reconstructionists don't even pretend, and this already started in the I mean, this goes back with Reform, it goes all the way back, but even in the mid-'80s, the Reconstructionists were saying, I don't care about these halachot. You decided a Kohen can't marry a divorcee. Why? Because back in the day when divorce was taboo and when it meant that the girl was used goods, she was stepped on, so like why would anybody want to marry her? So we have to have a special class of people who only marry women that are considered respectable to society. But even that's not true. It's not true. She could have been married 100 times and then widowed, and she's still marriageable to a Kohen. She could be divorced from a Kohen, and they wouldn't. Maybe they never. She was engaged in the divorce, and she could marry a Kohen already. So that's just their philosophy, the way they feel about these laws being applied. Conservatism is the only group that's actually still waging a war against orthodoxy, if you will, and that's what they're fighting over in Israel. They want acceptance of their rituals. They want conservative cares. Reform and Reconstructionists don't care. Conservative actually cares. They want halachic recognition of their marriages. They want halachic recognition of their divorces. Whereas Reform and Reconstructionists quit the game a long time ago. They don't believe any of this is necessary. And the reason I mention their political attitudes towards Israel is because I don't think they really feel that much of a connection to begin with. You understand? Like, these aren't the people who fought for the land. No flag-waving American Reconstructionist or Reform Jew was going to jump in the front of the Zionist line and go enlist in the Israeli army as a foreign fighter. It just didn't happen. And because they didn't fight for it, they don't appreciate it. Because they never felt much persecution in America anyway, they don't really have an appreciation of the need for a sovereign and independent Israel. And therefore, to them, it's not that big a deal. Of course, negotiate with the Arabs, live with them, because they're detached from the reality. That's the truth. And what better proof do you have than the fact that America and Europe are very upset that Israel they're trying to pass a new law now about the, do you saw this? Ayat Shachid, which happens to be fantastic, by the way. She wanted to pass a law that any non-governmental organization that gets more than 50% of its funding from a foreign government, not foreign entities, from a foreign government, needs to announce in all of its publications and all of its press conferences, I forget exactly what it included, they're all their social media postings, they have to post prominently that they're funded by foreign governments. In a lot of cases, it's the European Union, or it's a particular member state of the European Union, like France or England or Sweden, that's promoting certain non-governmental organizations, and they pay these people out of taxpayer money in Europe to antagonize Israel, to falsify claims of terrorism and abuse, and to prosecute them legally. Like, they give them to have a fund in order to make it difficult. So a lot of so-called well-meaning Reform and Reconstructionist Jews, if there is a mitzvah for them, it's be a nice guy, do chesed. I mean, for them, this is they interpret it to be this way. It's very easy for them, but it's only because of some kind of loose ethnic identification with Israel, not because they actually understand either the religion or in some cases even the connection to the land. They'll tell you, sure, but if the Jews came in 1948 and started a state here, what's at the fault of the Arabs? Who cares? So our history and our tradition go back further than this. But as far as the development of the movement, by the early 90s, they were already writing critically even of Reform, and they were basically saying we don't identify anymore with this movement. We can be an ethnic group that, like any other ethnic group, retains whatever they like about the tradition, throw away whatever you don't like. I think Reform would originally at least made the case that the Torah, the mitzvot, and the halachot were necessary at some point, or were considered necessary at some point. I think Reconstructionists will tell you it could have been done a number of different ways, and they kind of randomly or arbitrarily arrived at this. They don't even believe that it was divinely inspired, so they'll tell you it's what, God told us to do this? Who cares about kosher meat anymore? Like,
Do they have rituals? They have prayers and stuff? Or?
They might have something that they composed themselves. There certainly are no traditional references to the matriarchs or patriarchs. I mean, if only pro forma, they'll drop certain names, but a lot more of it is, prayers for the safety of the nation, prayers for the ends of disputes and resolution of conflicts, things like this. But the theology of it is very, very weak. And I made a point of this when we spoke about Moshe Mendelssohn in the 1700s. He was actually considered a theologian. I mean, the man did study, and he had beliefs. Now, where the line is drawn between the necessity of ritual and routine and actual physical practice of certain mitzvot in order for one, to be considered Jewish, in order for this connection with God to be made. He was arguing the point that this can be done in private. It doesn't necessarily need to occupy a very prominent place in your personality or in your social presence in order for yourself to be considered a valid halacha abiding Jew. But the beginning of kicking it back into the closet basically, ended up pushing it into a place where it doesn't feature even not so prominently. And then the question was it ever once necessary or relevant? And eventually it was, no, it could have been any other way. And that was the big split. Reform doesn't necessarily deny the existence of God. Reconstructionism will tell you that that's actually an optional thing and that everyone has their own personal connection with God, and Reform adopted some of that later on. Said, sure, we're not going to dictate to you what God is or isn't. It's not something that we define or that we have a dogma that everybody's expected to subscribe to. It's more like a personal journey that you find what inspires you and what motivates you. Leads to a whole list of other questions. But at any rate, I don't know that we can do justice to the Open Orthodox movement. We'll do it for next week. That's, I think, the most pertinent or most relevant movement right now for the Orthodox movement is how we chew on this Open Orthodoxy. They right now, as far as the Israeli Rabbinut is concerned, are basically on par with conservatism in the sense that they're not really considered, their conversions have already been rejected. And
yeah, but it's a 2-month-old movement.
What is, sorry?
That's a little bit older.
Open Orthodox.
How old the movement is? No, it's older than that. I mean, Rabbi Avi Weiss in Riverdale, that's not 2 years. I mean, he split with YU a long time ago.
Yeah, I heard about it literally 2 months ago when they started with this.
I think they were very careful about identifying themselves separately. Again, and we've seen, this has been the theme for all these movements of reform or movements of change, that they don't always jump out and tell you, we're a new movement, accept us. It's more like we're the continuation of the Christians believe too, that they're a continuation of Torah observant Judaism, and that this is where you would end up if you only followed the rules and heeded the call. In the case of conservatism, they'll tell you, look, we observe all the traditions, we observe all the halachot. We don't hold by stringencies in certain rabbinic invocations, but that aside, show me what biblical concept I'm violating. Like which halacha am I actually in transgression of by following the practices that I follow. So, it's an argument that they make. Reform and Reconstructionists don't make such an argument. They'll tell you, what do you mean? In the case of Reform, first it was rabbinic and then it was even biblical. In the case of Reconstructionists, it's more a question of divinity. Who are we as people to define anything divine or godly? Who's to say that Moshe Rabbeinu was on a higher level than me, or that he had revelations or epiphanies that I can't have on a daily basis? If he drank Starbucks coffee, he'd be writing what I'm writing now. That's the attitude that a lot of people have towards it. The name is what it implies. Reconstructionism is just, free thinking, look back with a critical eye, use your current paradigms and what science and current movements and philosophy teach you, incorporate them into what it is that you do, and you end up with a kind of Jewish take on history, is basically what...
Sounds like an ego trip, the way you describe it.
It really is. At the end of the day, that's the, the less politically correct, but probably the most accurate way to sum it up. If you believe, it's one of the 48 ways in which the Torah is acquired. This is a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, that emunat chachamim. Rav Rebbe, my Rav, used to define it this way. If you believe that you are learning from a bunch of monkeys, you're not going to look at it very seriously. You're not going to give it much consideration. You won't judge it favorably. You'll assume that contradictions are for real. You'll assume that there were oversights, there were mistakes, there were corruptions, prejudices, etc. When you consider that, these are men and women who devoted their lives to spirituality, who didn't hold much from the material physical world, who spent, entire lifetimes working on their midot, perfecting their perspectives and their interactions with people and their relationships with God, you look at it very differently. It really starts with a certain degree of arrogance where you can say, Moshe Rabbeinu was really no different from me. And David HaMelech, sure, I'm attracted to girls too, so I can easily, I could have sat down and had a beer and talked about this. I mean, that's what these movements basically were promoting. sometimes, out of sheer curiosity, I like to read or listen to some of the stuff that they publish on YouTube or things that you see in writing, sometimes coming out of supposed theological seminaries, etc. It's pretty shocking. You know? It's very easy to speak to a crowd and to tell them things that make them feel good. And if nothing else, I think you can say that in a way to the credit of the Christian movement, that really, you know, you can aim low. If a lot of the original adherents were fishermen, prostitutes, lepers, I mean, it was very easy for them to reach these people, make them feel good, and tell them they're all great and they're all divine. There's a line between approving of mediocrity or worse than that, and actually trying to inspire them to do something more. The problem with inspiring somebody to follow somebody else's lifestyle or somebody else's message is that it runs the risk of alienating people. You know, if I tell you that the Vilna Gaon had concluded the Shas by the time he was 13, and that, you know, they didn't find a teacher that was capable of teaching him anything at the time he was like 14 or 15, you say, well, shucks, you know, when I was 14 or 15, I was out playing basketball and going to summer camp, and I bought my first guitar, and I was like, you're not really, it's very hard to connect to that. It already requires a certain degree of reverence to be able to say that's someone special, that maybe at least in certain ways or at certain times I can kind of strive to be like. If you tell everybody, don't bother because they were at the same level you are, you know, the same joys and challenges, the same struggles that you have, you've diluted the message to nothing. You've concealed everything deep and profound and meaningful and significant about it, and you've lost an awful lot. There's a whole other side to this, which is that if you look, for example, in Maimonides, Rambam's Moreh Nebuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, he talks in very simple, basic terms about how you know, the Gemara, the Midrash, other cornerstones of our literature hid an awful lot of their wisdom in ways that your average reader couldn't pick up. In other words, they didn't leave it there on the table. There's some connections you have to make sometimes what seems to be contradictions or you know, like you have to really work at it. And all of a sudden you find these gems, you find these really valuable teachings. If you have conflicting accounts of certain things, or you have, you know, which mitzvah takes precedence over what, or what you're allowed to do under duress or under stress, I mean, you really test it, you push to the limits, you find out tremendous things, but it's not there for anyone to just read through and write a doctorate on, you know, on a Sunday afternoon. So, unfortunately, that's it. If you don't have any respect for routine and tradition, you believe that all these things were just forced on us by a bunch of rabbis who were trying to herd us like shepherds, you know, and get us to go in a certain direction, sure, you can pick it apart and you can decide that you're not going to keep any of it, but it's not doing much service to the background. I remember when I was at NYU, we had a guy who came to Minyan one day on a Shabbat afternoon. And he said that it was like one of his first times praying in an Orthodox minyan. He just decided to become more observant. He's like, because he grew up in a Reform congregation, he's like, all he told us about Orthodox was that they were all a bunch of primitive, you know, wife-beating, like psychopaths that you couldn't trust. These people, they're control freaks, and that it's all about, you know, oppressing their women and making them obedient. And, okay, so if that's what you grew up believing, you're gonna have a really hard time entertaining a serious discussion with someone who doesn't think that way or grew up in the tradition. So I think we'll leave that for next week because you're a little bit more on Rebbe, but I think we'll I'd like to dedicate at least one class to open orthodoxy and effectively assuming that conservatism is kind of irreconcilable with Orthodox practice the way that we understand it today. You know, open orthodoxy might be the one movement that's still clinging to what conservatism was trying to do in the the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, which is to retain a halachic a loyalty to halachic tradition, and at the same time open things up a little bit, right? And I don't mean that in any denigrating or a sarcastic way. I mean, maybe there are certain things that in Orthodoxy we could be, you know, more open to and a little bit more accepting of. The question only becomes, again, where's the limit and where do you draw the line? And sometimes, you know, is there room for drawing a line before the line needs to be drawn, or do we just keep on pushing for things to change until eventually you cause an avalanche and you once again lose control over where it stops? And you know, that's the discussion. If you talk about the Haredi movement, about the Orthodox movement, how the Orthodoxy is trying to distinguish itself, and at the same time trying to stay the same. It's a tough nut to crack. So, all right, take a quick couple of minutes, and we'll go over some halachot of Rebit.
What's open hours?